and welcome to this edition of IIEA Insights with me, Dan O'Brien. The past decade has brought enormous change, including in the realms of economic thought and economic relationships. Britain has left the EU. The US has imposed a sort of tariffs not seen in a century. China has gone from an economic opportunity to a huge challenge and a threat in many areas. The World Trade Organization is a shadow of its former self, with multilateral trade liberalization long gone from the agenda, and bilateral trade deals now the only form of liberalization taking place. The conflict in the Middle East underscores how supplies of imported goods are less secure than they once were, something made worse by the willingness of the big powers to weaponize trade. War in Europe and the threat of its spreading has multiple implications for economic security in the wider economy, and industrial policy, dirty words a decade ago, is now back in fashion, along with newly respectable protectionism. To discuss this bewildering array of changes and what they mean for Europe, Andrew McDowell joins us today from Luxembourg. Andrew, you're welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Dan.
As attendees will know, Andrew runs the European Investment Bank's global division, and before departing for Luxembourg almost a decade ago, he was chief economic advisor to the Taoiseach Enda, amongst other things. So look, Andrew, before we get into the economic security issues, maybe you might discuss a little bit about what the EIB does in general and what EIB Global does in particular, and how that relates to economic security and how your agenda has changed as the economic security agenda has changed.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dan, and thanks for the invitation today. And nice to join another seminar with the Institute of International European Affairs. So EIB, European Investment Bank. I mean, it's the EU's public bank, owned by the 27 member states, and there to finance long-term investments consistent with EU public policy goals. So, infrastructure, SME financing, innovation, cohesion, decarbonization, climate mitigation, adaptation, and so on and so forth. It's actually, and this isn't often well appreciated because we are kind of hidden here in the woods of Luxembourg, it's the largest public development bank in the world by far. In fact, it's twice the size of the World Bank. So we've a balance sheet of about 600 billion euro, which is quite significant. We do about 100 billion euro of new financing every year, of new financial commitments. My own part of the bank is indeed EIB Global, which is a brand and an organizational unit we consolidated fully within the wider European Investment Bank, but which is focused on the outside EU business, so on our lending and advisory activities in partner countries outside of the EU. And that's, in a sense, the baby brother of the EIB. We do about 10% of the annual business every year. And again, mostly in the space of long-term infrastructure financing in partner countries, but also increasingly in new areas, including innovation financing, including urban development, including obviously climate and renewable energy, and so on and so forth. And then the final piece of the puzzle within the EIB group, which may be well known to many people in Ireland, is the European Investment Fund, which is the part of the EIB that does SME financing mainly through funds by providing equity investments into VC and private equity funds. It is, in fact, the largest source of venture capital financing within the European Union. And I think many companies and funds in Ireland will have started life through investments from the European Investment Fund.
Okay, I wasn't aware of the role of the venture capital. We might come back to that later if we have time, and certainly I wouldn't be surprised if there's some questions. But let's start with your sense of how the broader economic security resilience piece has evolved and how it's perceived in the EU institutions.
Yeah, I mean, I was interested in this topic, and I've started to think about this topic quite a lot, mainly because this is actually my second stint in EIB. I was nominated previously by the Irish government to join the management committee of EIB back in 2016, and spent 4 years at EIB, then went into the private sector for about 4.5 years, and then came back to EIB last year to look to head up the global business. And what struck me, after I came back, was how much had changed particularly around this topic of economic security and how much time we now spend in EIB as a major investor in the EU and outside of the EU, how much time we spend on this concept, on looking at not just what we've always traditionally looked at in EIB, which is the credit quality and risk return aspects of our investments, the environmental and social aspects of our investments. Are they policy aligned and so on. I mean, these things we've always looked at as a public development bank. But how much time we now spend on whether these investments are aligned with the EU's economic security requirements. And you can imagine, obviously, we're a major energy financier. So, whenever we're looking at pipelines, interconnections, we are discussing and debating and we have a lot of technical expertise as to whether these things actually support EU's energy security. Critical raw materials, obviously, being a new area of the business that's growing extremely quickly and extremely important for the EU's economic security. Digital, both inside and outside the EU. What type of digital investments should we finance? To what extent can those digital investments incorporate Chinese components in particular that present potentially cybersecurity risks for the EU? Should we apply the same standards for investments inside the EU as we do outside of the EU? For example, should we have a lighter touch approach on investments outside of the EU where we might be less sensitive about cyber risks? It's not just in digital, increasingly in renewable energy. In batteries, there are components that cause significant concerns to intelligence services across the EU, and I'm particularly talking about the inverters in both batteries, in wind projects, but particularly in solar projects. Inverters are the components, if you like, the digital heartbeat of renewable energy that convert direct current into alternating current, but can potentially be accessed and controlled by external operators. That's part of their design, is in order to manage these projects. These components are basically controlled by computers, by operators outside of the projects themselves. And so you can imagine, a situation where in a situation of conflict, suddenly our digital economy is externally exposed and can be manipulated by external actors in a way that damages our interests. And given that all of these sectors are the sectors essentially that we finance, we now have a legion of people inside EIB whose job is nothing else but to go through the security aspects of the projects, the cyber aspects, the links with the wider EU energy policy, the links with wider EU digital policy. And we spend, I would say, 25% of our time literally on this aspect of the due diligence of our projects. And I say this because I think we're a little bit of a canary in the coal mine in some ways for the wider investment community, because I remember it was the same for us 10 years ago when we really started embedding climate risk in our due diligence process. And, we were, asking about issues to do with climate mitigation and adaptation in the projects we were doing 10 years ago. And a lot of our borrowers and promoters were saying, look, nobody else asks us these questions. Why are you asking? And obviously this became entirely mainstream about 5 or 6 years ago and became essentially regulated. And I think we're at the same stage now when it comes to economic security. I think the questions we're now asking of our borrowers and promoters and investees around the economic security aspects of their projects are going to become mainstream. And they're going to be the questions that other investors, commercial banks, pure private investors are going to be required to start asking, if not by regulation, certainly by good practice in the coming years. And I think our experience in this regard is somewhat instructive.
Okay, that's interesting. And in terms of trade-offs, particularly in the energy space, do you clearly, as you mentioned, 10 years ago and up to 5, 6, 4 years ago, less, the environmental element of energy policy was arguably the top priority, and security of supply was less so. Do you see a trade-off there? Do you see how those priorities are changing?
Look, I think there can be trade-offs in certain markets in particular countries. Having said that, I think and we look at developments obviously in the last number of weeks. And I think Europe is certainly glad that it went the route of investing heavily in electrification and the decarbonisation of its power systems over the last 10 years. Not enough by any means, and we still find ourselves obviously very, very exposed to fossil fuel dependency. But I think the share of fossil fuels in power generation, even since the Ukraine the Russian invasion of Ukraine has come down by, from about 20% to 30% to about 20% in the last number of years, and that's probably a very good thing. So in that sense, there was no immediate trade-off between our decarbonisation objectives and energy security objectives. However, there are certain markets where, for various reasons, decarbonisation has been harder to achieve and has progressed less quickly. And there are certainly those countries that are now reconsidering, obviously, the shift towards gas financing as part of their decarbonisation strategy and maintaining a focus on coal, which is unfortunate, but that is a trade-off in terms of decarbonisation versus energy security. But I do think that is going to be, unfortunately, a lesson learned, not so much actually within the EU, but certainly a lot of the markets I'm dealing with outside of the EU in Asia and in sub-Saharan Africa, we're on the path towards decarbonisation, the just energy transition partnerships where they were receiving extensive international financing, including from EIP, to abandon coal-fired generation. Unfortunately, I think some of that's going to be relooked at again.
Yeah, indeed. One of the great things of working in one of the EU institutions is that you get to meet people from many, if not all, of the member states. In terms of your the perception of your colleagues, do you see these threats differing depending on people's nationalities? There's the sort of classic, the French are traditionally classic, more willing to look at protectionism, and the Northern Europeans, for instance, are more of the free trading, no protectionism tradition. Do you see that those differences, do they continue to exist? Have they changed a bit? Is everyone a Gaullist today?
I think they probably are. I mean, there are some differences still in tone and in nuance in this debate and detail, but I think the strategic direction towards greater autonomy, strategic autonomy, technological autonomy, defense autonomy, energy autonomy, I think that's clear, and I think that generates a wide degree of consensus in European debates right now. I mean, again, the last few weeks have been instructive again for regarding European dependencies and vulnerabilities. But there still are nuances. There's no doubt about that. I mean, we've seen this in the the latest, and there's a whole swathe of new regulations obviously coming through Europe to try and advance economic security for European industry, whether it's the CHIPS Act, whether it's the most recently the Industrial Accelerator Act, and we do see nuances in these debates about to what extent we should include partner countries, reliable allies, as being part of our supply chains, and consider them as safe sources for critical raw materials, for semiconductors, for green tech. And this seems to be the critical debate. Not that we don't have to reduce our dependencies and manage our dependencies and set ambitious targets, but to what extent all of this has to be done inside of the EU itself, or to what extent this can be done in partnership with countries that we trust. And this is probably where the biggest debate is right now. I mean, it can be often summarized between the competing slogans of should it be made in Europe or should it be made with Europe? And made with Europe being, the viewpoint that we should integrate our trusted partners into our supply chains and not just be completely protectionist in terms of manufactured inside the EU. But I have to say, I think the overall direction of travel is widely shared, and I don't see a traditional ordo-liberal German versus French Gaullist breakdown in the approach here. I think we've all gone a little bit Gaullist in the last 5 or 6 years.
And that's exactly the kind of insights that I think we hope are valuable for members. We didn't discuss this in the run-up to this as we were preparing for this, Andrew, but the EIB's role in the defence industry, if you don't want to deal with it, that's absolutely fine. But can you say anything about that?
No, it's a very public issue. I mean, EIB has made a major pivot in the last 2 years into financing security and defence within Europe, which was an area which is outside traditionally EIB's eligibilities up until Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But quite clearly, the circumstances have changed, and the expectations of our shareholders, of the member states of the EU, have changed in the last number of years. We've gone from a situation where we were effectively doing nothing in the area of security and defence back in 2020 when I was last at EIB, to a situation last year where we financed about 5 billion in security and defence. Now that in itself is obviously not going to move the dial for European defence requirements. But it is very important in a number of specific segments of the European economy, particularly in the SME area, who are supplying some of the major defence contractors in the supply chains of the defence contractors. This was an area that was had a tendency to be underbanked inside the EU, because a lot of commercial banks did not like working with the defence sector or their supply chains. So as procurement expanded significantly, the big defence contractors themselves could raise money, but their supply chains could not. And it was quite a significant bottleneck for European industry. Equally, innovation in defence is an area that we finance, including through the European Investment Fund, which I've mentioned. Mobility, defence mobility, and some of the major transit corridors, particularly between, you can imagine, up from the Balkans towards the Romanian border, or indeed, from Rotterdam to the Polish border. These were infrastructure corridors that have degraded over the last 20, 30 years, can no longer carry the type of heavy armaments that are needed to make it within 48 hours or 36 hours from Rotterdam to the Polish border if a crisis requires. And there's huge investments required to upgrade the bridges, the railway systems, the signalling systems, and so on to get them there. So all of these things are areas that the EIB is now very active in. I should say we don't do this outside of the EU. This is only something we will finance inside of the EU, particularly because we draw great comfort, obviously, from EU export licensing regimes. So we know everything that we finance inside the EU. We know where it ends up, and it's controlled, obviously, very carefully. Outside of the EU, we don't have those same systems, and therefore it remains ineligible outside of the EU.
You mentioned trusted partners. Brexit is one of the things I sort of mentioned as being one of the major changes of the past decade. What sort of relations do you have with the UK since it left?
Yeah, again, I mean, the last time I was at EIB, I was dealing with the Brexit negotiations for EIB, and we came to a very constructive but unfortunate, obviously, arrangement with the UK to facilitate the UK's departure from the EIB, but very constructive in the sense that they continue to honour all their obligations to EIB. So in other words, we had a 600 billion portfolio, which included the support from their callable capital from the UK, and they continue to honour that commitment to the EIB to support that legacy portfolio from the time that when they'd been in the bank. So our relations with the UK have been very good. Now, we don't finance. Ever since Brexit, we cannot finance projects inside the UK. They're not a member. We do finance outside of the EU, as I've said before, But we have never come to an arrangement with the UK to finance projects inside the EU, which has been unfortunate for Ireland because that includes Northern Ireland, and this was something that was discussed back in the Brexit negotiations, but no agreement could be reached on how to overcome that. I do think the UK has missed EIB quite significantly. I mean, I think over the entire period of or ever since the UK and Ireland's accession in '73, we financed something like 120 billion of projects in the UK. So they were very dependent on EIB for financing PPPs, for financing universities, energy infrastructure. All the offshore wind in the UK was financed by the EIB. And they've never really been able to replace EIB. I mean, they have come up with new institutions like the British Business Bank and other institutions, but they're not on the same scale as EIB, and they don't have the same low funding costs as EIB. So obviously they're paying a lot more for their infrastructure since they left. So I think if there is, a debate going on in the UK about the merits of getting closer once again to the EU, I'm sure EIB is there somewhere on the agenda in terms of what new relationship they might be able to form.
Interesting. On a more sectoral basis, the CHIPS Act was one of the legislative initiatives taken since economic security has become more important. Would you give any assessment of how successful, unsuccessful, has it made a difference?
Yeah, so the EU CHIPS Act was an initiative back from 2022-23. When I think both Europe and the United States started to become much more aware of their supply chain vulnerabilities in the area of semiconductors, particularly obviously around Taiwan and our collective dependence on Taiwan for very sophisticated semiconductors, including now increasingly in the AI space, but not only. And both Europe and the United States launched similar initiatives. The US had its US CHIPS Act, and Europe had the European CHIPS Act, both with similar goals, which were to significantly reduce those vulnerabilities and dependencies and increase their respective shares of global markets. I think for Europe, the ambition was to increase Europe's share of production of semiconductors to about 20% of the global market. I think the United States had a slightly similar, but slightly higher ambition. Look, I think it's fair to say the US has been more successful. I think Europe it's been a partial success. It's been probably very good for the European R&D sector. So Europe is now one of the is still one of the leading in research and development centers for semiconductor design and semiconductor manufacturing techniques and manufacturing equipment. And that's partly, some of the R&D tax incentives were very successful. There was some increases in the EU budget through Horizon and other interventions for the European semiconductor sector, which were largely successful. Where it has failed compared to the United States is increasing in production capacity, so manufacturing. And the US has mobilized significant investments in manufacturing in semiconductors, and Europe has not done so to the same extent. And that's probably a reflection of a number of things. I mean, energy costs are so much higher inside the EU, and that is a critical component of semiconductor manufacturing. Permitting is being another problem inside the EU. Again, the US had a very aggressive approach to permitting of new fabrication facilities. Again, this was kind of left to the member states inside the EU. US probably was also more fiscally supportive of semiconductor manufacturing. I mean, again, the production tax credits in the United States were very generous. Also some grants through the federal government. In Europe, it was kind of left to all the member states. So, I mean, there was an easing of state aid restrictions, but there was really no new money given to it. So I think we are still in a situation, unfortunately, within Europe, where if things go wrong in Taiwan, we're in very, very deep trouble. And I think that's why the European Commission is having another reflection this year on the Chips Act. So, I mean, we may see a Chips Act 2.0 at some stage later this year, which will probably try and resolve a lot of those weaknesses in the first initiative.
Tell me this: obviously the federal government of the US isn't so concerned about geographic location of these when it spends its money of the plants, whereas in Europe it's a more fraught issue. You know, if Commission money, European money, is going to go to building huge plants. Obviously, the country that gets it, it's good news, but the countries that don't get it feel, you know, they're losing out. Is that a dynamic that's hindered investment in manufacturing capacity?
Well, I think so. But now I wouldn't understate the degree to which, you know, the American states aren't also individually, you know, competing for the investments and quite sensitive as to where federal money goes. Anyone who's watched the US Congress or US Senator work will know this. But I think no. I mean, I think in Europe, you know, the major weakness is that there is very little European money going into supporting the sector. It's really been left to the member states. So even with the CHIPS Act back in 2022, there was a kind of exhortation on the member states to do more to support semiconductor manufacturing. There was an easing of the state aid restrictions by Brussels. There was an exhortation on us at EIB to do a lot more financing in the sector, which we've done. But there was very little extra EU budget money, unlike in the United States. And obviously, unlike the United States, and this is one of the challenges I think facing Europe, the United States has very powerful tools when it comes to their tax code, the federal tax system. You know, we saw this with the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA Act, you know, how powerful that could be now, since being obviously undone by the new Trump administration. But you know, they also provided very generous federal tax rebates for the semiconductor industry, and that's very powerful. That's simply a tool that Europe does not have because of the absence, obviously, of a common European tax system.
Onto the evolving Industrial Accelerator Act that I think is going to Parliament, to the European Parliament. It hasn't gone already. It aims to boost manufacturing as a share of GDP from 14% now to 20% by 2030. That seems like a very ambitious target. Any thoughts on the Industrial Accelerator Act? And certainly there's some concern that it's excessively protectionist. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, I think this is a monster, sorry, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but anybody who's not paying attention to the Industrial Accelerator Act should be, because I think it's a major evolution in European economic policy, and really is pivoting the EU towards a much more activist role in shaping industrial evolution. And I mean, unlike the CHIPS Act, the big difference between the Industrial Accelerator Act and the CHIPS Act, I mean, the CHIPS Act was obviously focused primarily in the semiconductor sector, but it really was about supply conditions. It was about the supply side of the economy. It was about permitting. It was about R&D. It was about, you know, those framework conditions. The Industrial Accelerator Act, by contrast, is about the demand side. It's about saying, no, it can't just be about the supply conditions. We really need to shape and provide a more predictable environment for demand for key technologies within Europe in general through local content requirements in public procurement. And so, you know, at the heart of the Act is the idea that that anything that is supported by public procurement, public subsidies, public-private partnerships, public awards, can be subject to local content requirements, and they will vary depending on the sector. But, you know, I think in the example of for example, electric vehicles, it's going to be 70%. In certain clean tech sectors like solar, it could be up to 90%, and so on and so forth. And I think compared to anything we've seen before, such as, you know, the CHIPS Act or the Net Zero Industry Act before it, this is quite a radical change in the direction of EU policy. How protectionist, how strict will it be? I think this is going to be the debate over the next two years as this passes through, obviously, the legislative process with the European Council and with the Parliament. And again, we'll go back to the debates that I was mentioning before. When we say, 70% of the content of an electric vehicle needs to be consistent with secure supply chains, does that mean it has to be made inside of the EU in one of the EU member states, or can some of those parts come from the UK? Can they come from other countries, that the EU has done trade agreements with? I mean, this is going to be one of the critical questions. I think that's going to be asked, and it's not, and that there's definitely a fault line, you can see, but within the European Council on issues like that. But having said that, again, I think the general direction of travel is clear. There's going to be probably a significant majority for this piece of legislation in both the Parliament and the Council, but the debates will be around the details. And how strict will the definitions of EU eligibility be? Will it be WTO compliant? Does that matter anymore? How difficult will the bureaucracy be in terms of implementing it, in terms of, audits around the supply chains and certificates of origin and all of this? There's going to be a lot of debates about those details. But the general direction seems to generate broad consensus. And so already we are, in EIB, we're already beginning to embed these processes and requirements in our due diligence just to anticipate what's coming.
And there's also, let me just echo that thing that you mentioned, that people really need to pay attention to this. This is a really big change, and I'm surprised it's got as little attention. Maybe because the war has deflected people's attention in the war in the Middle East. But another aspect of it that is particularly relevant here in Ireland is the ownership that it's in it. It's looking for foreign investors coming into the EU, partnering with European companies. Now, it certainly raises the question to me what that means for pharmaceutical investment in particular in Ireland. Does that come into play, and will that be affected by this?
Yeah, I mean, potentially, yeah. I mean, when you think about it, it's amazing. It's amazing how much the world has changed in 15 years, when Europe was threatening to take China to the WTO for forced technology sharing around European investments in China. And obviously the logic of this is not so much targeted at the United States, but more targeted at China, in terms of Chinese investments in Europe, in particularly the clean tech sector and the battery sector, and trying to make sure they're done in a way that actually increases the EU's own industrial know-how and capacity. We've seen valiant efforts by Europe to try and catch up, for example, in the battery sector, but that have largely failed. And because China really does have a very difficult to catch technological leadership in this space right now. And if we're all moving towards an electrified economy, batteries are going to be at the heart of that economy. And it's quite clear that there is a huge concern about complete dependence, not just actually on Chinese, but also on Korean and Japanese battery systems for into the future. The Chinese are investing heavily in Europe in the battery sector, but obviously doing so in a way that does not increase European industrial capacity and know-how. And so I think a lot of those particular provisions in the Industrial Accelerator Act are motivated by the experience of Europe in the battery sector in particular, but not just the battery sector. And it could well be they start looking at other areas like pharmaceuticals. But to be honest with you, Europe still is sufficiently strong in pharmaceuticals and the life sciences more generally. I don't think it would like to see these measures replicated in other countries in pharmaceuticals. It's in areas like clean tech in particular where Europe has fallen behind and is seeking to catch up.
Yeah, and just one of the provisions in the Accelerator Act is that if a company comes from a country that has 40% of global market share in a sector, that they'll be treated differently. And that was clearly designed with only one country in mind, China. But with this discussion, it strikes me that we could well have a future event focused entirely on the Industrial Accelerator Act, given the scale of it. But coming back to China, Andrew, China's Belt and Road, the last time I was in China, I was asking everyone, explain this to me. What does it mean? How's it going to work? And got different answers from different people. How do you see a parallel with what the work of the EIB Global in particular, and how China is using the Belt and Road initiative to deepen its connections with the rest of the world?
I mean, I think you'd have to say on its own terms, China's Belt and Road Initiative has been a fairly unqualified success for China over the last, well, 13 years. I think it got officially launched, it was in 2013, but I mean, it's never been a single tool or a single instrument. It's been an orientation that China has had, and that Xi Jinping has given the industrial and financial system of China to encourage it to invest in partner countries in particular sectors, particular technologies, in order to deepen their trade and investment relationships with China. And when you look at a map of the world, like over this period, and the number of countries for whom either Europe or the United States was their largest trade and investment partner, say back in 2010, and you look at it now from 2025, the map has literally turned red, over this period of time. Now, it's not to suggest that the Belt and Road Initiative was the only reason for that, but it certainly has been a very powerful tool in integrating, enormous parts of the world into Chinese supply chains. Yeah, I say, a great success. There has obviously been a lot of criticism of it, including actually within China, interestingly. There's been criticism of it that has been wasteful in parts, that some of the projects have been badly designed, that the standards have not been of the highest order, that they've not taken good care of debt sustainability in a lot of the countries in which they're working in. So in other words, they're lending to weak countries with bad governance, for bad projects that are never going to generate the cash flows needed to repay the debts that have financed those investments. And there have been many cases of that. But on the whole, you would have to say, as a geopolitical tool, it's been quite a stark success for China, and something we need to emulate.
Great, Andrew, we've hit the deadline. Apologies to the large number of people who put questions in, and we didn't get to them. But lots of insights there, and certainly a full episode on the Industrial Accelerator Act might be in the offing in the future. Again, Andrew, thanks so much for joining us. Really rich discussion, lots of good points, and great to have you back at the Institute. We'll look forward to having you back again, not before too long. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.